Okay, so we abstracted the clouds. So you can see like here, you would basically, to switch one cloud to the next, if they were compatible, you just basically remove this, and there were edits, and then add the other one. So out of that also came the idea of, well, all of these sort of are combined together to represent a kind of application, so a pattern, right? So you could sort of think of it as, well, we're describing pattern, we're describing the application at a very high level. Of course, it's not drag and drop, but you can edit them, add things, remove it, then you build patterns out of it, right? So we started, sort of exploring what it meant to have these, and then, we had YAML description of all of these things. And then we started putting really cool stuff, like for instance, showing that, getting like graph data, data that we could graph. We even looked at CO2 emissions, saying that, if we assume that for a particular cloud, for every instance, this is how much CO2 that you would generate, we would put a graph, and then we use Google Graph. So basically made it pretty, right? This is iteration after iteration after iteration. And then of course you can see this is running on Amazon, so we knew essentially the data on Amazon and so on. Then we looked at, well, what about cost? We knew how much money and when we deployed, how many instances, and we knew how much it cost. So we could build a cost model and put this in. So the reason I'm showing you all this is because I want, one of the things we wanted to show is that you could compare it. We could say, if you deploy it on different clouds, this is how much it costs. And of course, you can see GAE here is flatline because at the time it was 0. It was free. So we could do comparison like this. The other thing we did is, because we exposed services, there was this other group in Toronto looking into a similar thing, except they had a very basic description in one file, an XML file. And then from that description, they would do the deployment. So what we did is we integrated with them. They didn't have a UI, so it was, I think we did this in a week, where we integrated with them, and you can see this became the Virtuoso integration. And what we ended up doing is, these were their different components. So they had things like HA Proxy, Smash, MySQL, and so on. And we, essentially, as we integrated with this group, we absorbed their description into ours. So we did essentially a one-to-one mapping. But we did it so quickly that people got interested and understood, where it could go. So the next thing that came out of this is IBM PureSystems. So out of that work, we went through a 2-year cycle to essentially create what is the IBM PAS right now. And the reason this took so long is because people kept renaming it. Okay, and that's not because of the renaming, but essentially in 2 years' time, they went through what we call Maestro, Smart Metal, WCA, IWD, and then now PureSystems. At every stage, they ended up hiring or getting a group of almost, I think, at the peak, and Smart Metal was kind of the peak. We had almost, I would say, 110 people working on this. So as research, I basically was completely out of it. So I was put on the side where they would ask me, I would listen to the calls, be part of it, and I had a very small piece. From something that I completely built with a group in Toronto, so Ajith and I and Roy, and then a group in Toronto, it became 150 people where even I wasn't even involved all that much. So you gotta know when to let go also, that's important. The other thing is, they completely rebuilt the whole thing. So we built it in Ruby on Rails, they completely rebuilt it in Java. And completely different technology, completely everything, very, very different. So from what we have to something else. And the other thing is, part of the reason that they rebuilt, they didn't reuse any of the code that we had, is because they didn't know any of it. Meaning, they didn't know Ruby, they didn't know Rails, they had very, minimal notion about REST, YAML they didn't understand. So anything they did not understand, they basically built their own. they build a new version with their own technology. So you almost have to expect that, okay? And then the other thing is I found that bugs and bug fixes are so important to these development teams that they are sort of, where people get glory. So going to multiple iterations means finding bugs and then getting to a whole cycle of fixing bugs. So, in research, you tend to sort of not worry about this. This is important to the development team. Okay? Then the other important thing is people don't even understand, typically at first, the marketing message. And until that's understood, the project doesn't go anywhere. So in other words, I think as a research, as part of research, if you want your project to be successful, you almost have to be part of the marketing team or help them. So I ended up spending quite a bit of time with the marketing team trying to make them understand, and there's an easy way to do this, is to compare what you're doing with what other folks are doing. And the reason that's an easy way is because if you think about it, if there's another company exposing a similar product than what you have, they have a marketing message. So pick, for instance, Microsoft, right? They have Azure. So if you go to the Azure website, you'll see that they have a huge marketing message behind Azure. So as a researcher, what you can do is you can say, this is how my project compares to Azure. This is how my project compares to GA. This is how my project compares to XYZ, right? So by comparing it, you give the marketing team a way to just go to the Azure website and look at the marketing message. And I'm not saying they're going to copy it, but they're going to understand it because the marketing speak. So in other words, you either learn how to speak marketing or you compare yourself with another product and then you let them go find the marketing message there. So this is very important, okay? And then the other thing is nobody, and I mean this, nobody cares about theory. So don't even bring that up. Right? It's unfortunate because sometimes that's where the innovation is. So instead, do patents. If you can say, I had 3 patents on this, and that patent was built on the theory you did, then that's where they keep. Because then it becomes a marketing message. We have 3 patents. Even if they don't understand how to fight that patent, that's going to be the message. Right? So when you're working on the theory aspect, make sure you submit a patent somehow. Figure out a way. I mean, it's not always easy, so figure out a way to do that. So here are some screenshots.
You cannot lead the project if you cannot market your work.
Yeah. Marketing becomes
somebody else who is marketing, you land a button for that person.
So here's a screenshot of what end up becoming the project. Okay. I think I have it live if the network is up. We can look at part of it. So you can see how pretty it is, right? So, and this is just one piece. I have to tell you, before you even get to that screenshot, there's like, 2 or 3 that you can go through where you can set up your own cloud, you can partition the cloud, you can look at the servers, you can look at a particular sort of like unit on a server. So basically, this entire PureSystems is IBM solution for public and private cloud. So you can buy an entire piece of hardware, and I can show you, sort of like this, this big. It comes all the way here, and it has like the storage, it has the CPU, it has the power and everything, and then it has the software. So you get this, you plug it in, and then you have this software. And this software has ways, before you get to the software, the application piece, there's a way for you to say, I want to configure this guy for my organization that has 5 branches so that one piece of it is for the US, one piece of it is for Europe, and so on. And then I want to say how many VMs I can do, so I think there's a limit of 10,000 VMs per box, so you can sort of assign the VM. So you get all this, kind of pieces. Then you get the software, which is, what kind of software can you install, the patterns, and so on. So this is the screenshot for that. And you can see those components, you drag and drop them. So I'm not showing you this, but you drag them, you connect them together, right? Another important and interesting thing they did is you can do things like, for instance, adding policies. So you can say things like, for instance, I want to add a scaling policy or a log policy or wooding policy. You can add a JVM policy, for instance. In this case, you can say, you know, I want to specify, you know, the heap size of my JVM, right? So it became a very, very thorough, complicated system, right? And visual with, so you understand why there was almost 150 developers on this. And then, of course, when you deploy it, you get to see each virtual machine, you get to see a history log, you get to access the endpoints, you know, and so on. To make it even more interesting, they decided, in addition to this higher level view where you're looking at the components, you know, in terms of, like, say, WebSphere, Ruby, or whatever, you can also look at it from the perspective of an image. So you can have what they call the pattern editor for systems, where you can go and take the core OS and drop it, and then build your own, what they call virtual system. So what I showed you before is virtual applications. So in other words, from one idea of building patterns, they sort of decoupled it into two, where there's one very abstract version that's working at the application layer, and then another one that's working at the system layer or the image layer. You can add scripts, you can add any additional components, and then all very visual, right, and so on. So this is an example of how you connect two components together. So all of this is to say that from what we did, it became a complete monster that even I have a difficulty sometimes using, because there are so many different components, right? So, I mean, it's a good sign, but it's also kind of scary, because you end up having a system that you thought you created, or at least you contributed in creating, but you don't even understand anymore. So I think, you know, from kind of this evolution, if you may, you can see kind of what the initial idea of doing mashups, where it became, and with having a little piece of that to deploy on a cloud, became something where you can deploy anything on a cloud that's very flexible, that works for companies from 100 people to 10,000 people, to a piece of hardware that costs almost $1 million each.
So did people draw the line between what you did to the PureSystems or no?
Well, so very important. You gotta stay involved so that people remember you. Okay? And the way, yeah, because if you show screenshots of what you did, like, you know, 3 years ago, it's very hard for people to remember. So you gotta keep reminding people. But there's also a trick to this. The trick is to be blogging. Be in the public, right, with opinions, so that people see you as an expert and that they associate what you do with that work.
And you have a timestamp.
That's it, and you have a timestamp.
And in the blogging, if you just blog some idea that maybe in your mind very bright, but it's not very clear and very concrete, then people would not give you the credit or connection. You may think that you have done this. So you have to be more specific about exactly what it is. And maybe there is a screenshot, maybe there is an example, maybe there's a use case, maybe there is a customer thing. I think you have to, you know,
yeah, and you gotta almost keep blogging, so that, you know, of course you gotta be careful, because blogging means that you're putting yourself out there. So it's risky, and that's part of the reason not everybody does it. But by blogging, you put yourself apart, especially if you start building a following. And it's hard, but when you do that, then you can start blogging about work that you do and connecting it with the products. Then you become an expert, and what happens is the sales team will start going to you. You know, a big company like IBM, one of the things that differentiates it from other companies, and you're going to hear that if you talk to other companies, is that they have a sales force that is incredibly big. And as research, you tend not to connect to them, right? You're not always connected to the sales force. If you start blogging, then you're putting yourself out there and you're in a public eye. The sales force know about it. And when the sales force start getting people that they're trying to sell to, so they're trying to sell to company A, company B, and that company says, I read this blog by this guy, then they'll come start, referring to you. So that's why, being in the public eye is good. It's risky because, you certainly have to be very careful, but that's the best way. So if you have ideas, if you contributed to big projects and you start, starting realizing that what you did took a life of its own, and the development team will continue doing this, and they'll keep improving it, you won't even know. So you want to blog, put ideas out there, contribute, so on, so that people bring you back in. Okay. If you go to the development team and say you want to be part of it, then they'll say, well, why don't you move in? So in other words, leave research and join me, right? Which they proposed to me a couple times already, right? So it depends on if you want to stay in research or be in development. But here are some myths, okay, that I find, and I think they're just lies in my mind. First thing is that funding is the primary concern. I think that's not true. You shouldn't worry about funding when you come into industry research. It's important, but it's not the primary concern. Knowing who has the fund is the primary concern. And the reason is that the funding, usually it's decided. What I mean by this is, if you're coming in, if you're joining IBM, let's say today, and I think most companies also, I would say in the next year, most of the decisions are made. I mean, it's not that everything is cast into stone, but the decisions are made in the sense that if you're somebody that controls $1 million, you're not going to give it to anybody that you don't know, right? And that's all the money you have. So it means that you're going to be giving it to people that you know, that you've worked with for the past 5 years, which means that you're at a disadvantage. So either you start joining with somebody that has funding, or you start getting to know that person that has funding. The reason I say this is because what you're going to find is the first year in research, you're usually going to be in a group, but it's going to be encouraged for people to find their own funding. I would say don't spend 1 second trying to find funding. Spend every time you can knowing the people that have the funds. So in other words, don't try to go and present ideas and say, oh, I have this idea, why don't you fund me? Instead, listen, get to know the person that has the money, spend your time helping somebody else, spend your time doing something else, and get to know the people that have funding. Okay? That's what I would suggest for 2 years. Now, once you know the people and they start knowing you, then you go fund. You go ask for funding. So in other words, I'll give you an example. I've known Ajith for a while. I think if I needed funding from him, now might be a good time. But if you just met him and you said, Ajith, I'm looking for funding, here's a good idea, it's probably not going to work out until he knows you. It's the same idea, right? They got to know you before, especially in big companies. Maybe in ventures it's different, but I think when it comes to big companies, it's like that. The other thing also, it's the same idea with resources. Saying I need 1 intern, you're never gonna get that. But if you know the process, then it may work out in your favor in the future. And the reason is that getting resources inside a big company is not just hard, but also there are time limits, or there is a process involved. I believe that to get intern, it usually starts around, say, December of the year prior, and then people make most of the decision in January or something. And then by that time, you either have your intern or you don't. So when I got Ajith, I didn't even ask for it. Somebody came to me and says, I know you're working on this thing, and the process means that we have an intern available, and this one person left. So would you use it? And of course, immediately I called Ajith or sent him an email, and then we connected. Right? So it's best to just be ready and then know when the right time. If you go and keep asking for resources, you're wasting your time. Okay? Papers, they are important, but I find that probably what's more important is to do patents. So focus on patents. Now, no matter what your opinion of patents are, right? I mean, I know most of you probably think, patents, you know, it's stifling innovation. You hear that all the time. You see people suing each other and so on, right? Well, until there's a solution for this, right, which none of you are going to solve, it's your best bet for two reasons. First, it counts to some extent that, you know, you can claim it, you know, you can put it in your resume and so on. But most importantly, I would say that first reason is that you get money. So companies like IBM have an incentive. So they, like the patent that we have, once it's issued, I think we'll get $2,000 and we'll split it between the inventors. But it's not just that money, it's also when it's filed. You didn't get anything because you were not an IBMer, but I got, you know, some amount. So every time, you know, the patent process gets, you know, to the next step, if you may, you get some money. And I think per patent, I would say you can expect something like $1,500 to $2,000, right? Now, I mean, it's not a lot of money, but, you know, it's enough that, you know, if you have 10, you know, it can become interesting, right? So, so I think you play with the system versus trying to play against it, right? So no matter what your opinion is. Because the other thing also is to realize that every company has patents, especially companies like IBM, because they're trying to also be defensive. I mean, if you look at the history, recent history, we did sue some companies here and there, but usually it's done more in terms of as a defensive mechanism. So, you know, if anybody comes and says, we want to sue you because you're using this particular idea that we have patented, IBM can usually come with like 10 ideas that says, you know, you're infringing on 10, so what are you going to do, right? So that's the whole game. That's how the game is played. You know, you can see Google is playing that game. Facebook is also, they bought a bunch of patents from us so that they can play that game, right? So it's a defensive thing, but for an employee, it's actually a great thing because you get paid. And then the second reason is that for every patent, it's usually a paper. So if you think of it as a patent first, then you automatically have a paper. Whereas if you have a paper first, you may not have a patent. So focus on the patent, and then, you know, you'll have a paper. And if you want me to elaborate on this in terms of, you know, what's different between a patent and a paper, we can do that. Just ask me. You know. The other thing is what's important. I think doing it, maybe none of this is like groundbreaking, okay, but quick development is key. I think, you know, you guys should learn a lot from Ajith. I mean, he really impressed me by how quickly he could learn and get, you know, involved and be part of the development cycle and help get something built very quickly and short. Because from the time he joined, within a week we were demonstrating. And we kept doing this every week almost. I mean, we had demonstration every week. So it can be boring at times if you keep doing this for a long period of time, but that's usually how you get the attention of people, okay? And then integrating with existing tool, making it quick. So if you remember, I mentioned initially the first work we did, Splash Up, was sort of its own thing, you know, by itself. Then when I moved to Alto Communities, I had APIs. Well, because I had APIs, I was able to integrate with Andrew Trussman in Toronto within a week. So people were really impressed by this. And that's how this whole thing started. So being able to integrate, keep in mind, so you almost build your stuff to integrate with somebody else. And the reason is, think about it this way. Andrew, who's a really cool guy, became a distinguished engineer this year also. He had his own thing that he was working on, right, in cloud. And I had my own thing. And they were completely different from the perspective of how we were thinking of it, but they were going in the same direction. And it was hard for me to go and tell him, hey, you know, I mean, if you remember, we had everything he did, we also had a version of it, okay? But because we could say, well, you know, fine, you had this backend piece, and we also had our backend, but we can remove our backend and replace it with yours. All of a sudden, he loved everything else we had. So, in other words, by integrating with him, you give him a reason to like what you have. If you don't integrate, then he has his own thing, you have your own thing, there is no connection, right? So connecting the pieces is key. So very, very important. And keep giving talk. I mean, this is the only way that you can get people to know what you're doing, right? To keep doing that. So I'll close with these takeaways. I mentioned code iteration. It's key to success, so rinse and repeat, okay, all the time. Keep up with the trends. I think it's key. So Amit is a good person to follow in that sense, is that he's always sort of, compared to other academics, always at the edge of what's the trend, what's the current trend. This is very important because large companies tend to not, follow those trends quickly because they tend to go against their business, right? Something like social network. I mean, why would people do social network? Like now, everybody's trying to do it, but 3 years ago, you can ask. We did it, but if you talk to companies, they would be like, why would I want to do social network? Why would I want to connect my people, right? And then gradually it's becoming this. Trust me, it's sort of like that. Clouds. 4 years ago I presented about cloud and people were telling me that this is crazy, it's never going to happen because companies want to control their resources. And then they start realizing it's not that important to them. So in other words, trends, when they first come out, the first 2 years when people talk about it, be involved, know what's happening because this is a good place for innovation in large companies. Finding a champion is maybe the most important thing in terms of having somebody in the product team that know you and that can champion you, right? And maybe the best way to do this these days is through social networks. So connect with people on Facebook, LinkedIn, I mean, it doesn't mean like liking everything they post, right? It means connecting with them and, building a social network. I mean, if they're local, then it's best to go to lunch, right? But if they're not local, how are you going to meet with them? So, and I'll give you an example of this. So one of the fellows at IBM who helped me quite a bit was essentially somebody in Raleigh, Jerry Cuomo, that whenever I'm in Raleigh, he doesn't usually meet with anybody. I was there 2 months ago, I pinged him, and he cleared his schedule to meet with me. And the reason is because I kept up with him on social networks, he knows what I'm doing, and stuff like that. So, make sure you do that. So that also means don't post pictures of yourself.
I had challenged to convince even some of them to be connected to me on social networks.
Right. Now, that also means
it's LinkedIn. Forget about it.
Yeah, at least
but
that.
I know at least 1 or 2 of them who are not connected to me on LinkedIn. Now I'm not going to ask in
right. No, you have to. I don't think there's any other way. Don't post pictures of yourself drunk. Right? I mean, right? That's only for close friends. So clearly, there are things you don't want to do, but you gotta use social networks. That's key. I think if you live, I made a mistake here. In the bleeding edge, it's a lot of fun, but you gotta know when to leave. Also, you gotta know when to say, I'm gonna pack up, and because it's fun to be always kind of like what's interesting. So I'll give you an example of this, is semantic web, okay? I mean, arguably you could say it's a success, it's a failure, it still hasn't happened, it's gonna happen, right? So when I was graduating, it was the bleeding edge. And it was interesting, it was fun, it was lots of different things. But you gotta know when to say, okay, I'm done with it, I'm moving on. Because, and this is not just semantic web, it's any other sort of, bleeding edge thing. Because you don't want to be cast. What ends up happening in big companies is that then people will say, like whenever a semantic web comes, they'll associate you with it. Or whenever some other technology comes, they'll associate you with that technology. So you don't want to be casted, right? It's almost like actors, right? I mean, who's a good actor that would be, if you think of any of the famous actors now, like Brad Pitt, Angelina Jolie, or so on, would you cast them for a particular, role? These 2 actors I mentioned, they became very famous by doing a lot of different things. But some actors tend to be famous for one particular thing, and they get casted in that particular area. You hear that all the time. So you don't want to be casted also. right? Even though you might be excellent in that particular area. Now it's important to have your expertise, but it's also important to show range. And then you got a blog. I think if anything, make sure that you're connected and that you're blogging, you're tweeting, you're doing all these different things, because what you're doing here is you're building your own brand. Okay? And that's important. I can tell you that, I'll give you an example. If you go inside IBM and you talk about Amit, he has his own brand. People know him for what he did, for the work that he did. People know him for the database work and for semantics. That's his brand. You want to have your own brand as well once you leave the school. And it's hard to figure out what exactly you want that brand to be.
And yet you pack up and leave also. I stopped doing database work more than a decade ago, right? I still, yesterday it seemed like I was ranked 18th in the database literature for time. But I have not done anything for database for 15 years now. And so, hopefully the next time, the next things is there, I hope to be there.
So you stay on the edge, but build your brand as somebody that is known for something. And then eventually you can, branch out. So with that, I'll tell you, follow me on Twitter, or if you go to my webpage, you'll see that I'm basically, connect with me socially. I have all the connections. And I'll take questions, discussions.
So when should we pack up and leave? Because you spoke about semantic web, so that's just my question.
So a lot of this is when you join research and industry, right? So I'm thinking of Ajith, who's finishing, right? As you are in the PhD program, packing up and leaving, you can do the time to finish the work that you have here. I mean, I don't think you want to be a student forever, right? and you hear all the time, right? ABD, it's true, right? Lots of people are ABDs. Don't be one other ABD. So what that means usually is that you spend 4 years and you're like, okay, I'm ready to pack up and leave, but it might mean, finish that next 5 miles, It's like, anybody here run marathons? Or do? I run marathons, and I'm running one this weekend. And I can tell you, I'm not telling you go run a marathon, okay? You gotta train for that. But there's a lot to learn about endurance sports. And usually it tests your character, right? I'm running this weekend, and I've run, it's in San Francisco. And if you've been to San Francisco, if you've seen pictures of San Francisco, it's kind of hilly, right? Well, the marathon is like that too. The slogan for it is called "Worth the Hurt." That's how bad it is, right? So you start the marathon, and you go to the Golden Gate Bridge, and you do all this stuff, and it's all nice, right? And then around miles 20, you look at a hill that's like all the way here. And it's mile 20, you still have 6 more miles to go. Your legs want to give up, everything wants to give up. And that's usually how it feels in a PhD. When you start thinking, okay, it's time to pack up and leave. But what's cool is that you have 6 more miles, right? And if you push to it, then you get to the finish line. So PhD is like that. If you're not feeling that way, you probably didn't try enough.